say it, I say it again, you've been had. You've been took. You've been hoodwinked, bamboozled, led astray, run amok.
Our main story tonight is income inequality. Last December, the president made it clear that income inequality was going to be a big priority.
The combined trends of increased inequality and decreasing mobility pose a fundamental threat to the American dream, our way of life, and what we stand for around the globe. I believe this is the defining challenge of our time.
The wealth gap is getting worse. A new analysis shows the richest Americans, the top 1%, made nearly 20% of all the available income in America last year. That's the widest income gap since the Roaring '20s.
Contributing to poverty, stagnating wages. As this graphic shows, wages adjusted for inflation have been virtually flat during the past 45 years.
The Bureau of Labor Statistics has many different data sets which demonstrate how wages and benefits for working class people began falling in the 1970s and have been relatively flat ever since the early 1980s. This data set shows that weekly wages and benefits fell by $120 per week, roughly $6,000 per year between 1972 and 1980. And then since 1980, wages and benefits for workers have been flat ever since. And more than one source of data shows this information to us, that wages and benefits for working class people have basically stagnated for the last 40 years.
Oh, I say it again, you've been had.
This is from an article posted at the nationaleconomicseditorial.com showing the same information, that real wages in constant dollars have been flat since roughly 1973. $22.07 an hour by this measure in 1973. $20.74 an hour is the current wage rate in 2014.
I think most people are aware that for the last 40 years, the middle class of our country has been in decline. That in Vermont and all over this country, we have people working 2 or 3 jobs. We have people working 50, 60, 70 hours a week just to put food on the table, just to make sure that their families can live with a modicum of dignity. And the reason for all of that is that wages in the United States of America are just too low.
The textbook I used to teach high school economics shows the same information on page 224. Real wages down. In recent decades, though, the paychecks for American workers have actually been shrinking. And it says over here, in constant dollars, average wages actually declined to just about $222 per week in 1980 dollars. In other words, real weekly wages have fallen about $19 per week in 27 years.
You've been had.
This is a CNN Money article from February 16th of 2011, titled How the Middle Class Became the Underclass. And it stresses the point that incomes for 90% of Americans have been stuck in neutral, and not just since the Great Recession of 2008. Middle class incomes have been stagnant for at least a generation, while the wealthiest tier has surged ahead. In 1908, the income of the average American taxpayer was $33,400, adjusted for inflation. Fast forward 20 years, and not much has changed. The average income is still just $33,000 in 2008.
Rocky, do you believe that America is the land of opportunity?
Yeah.
More than a generation's worth of stagnant wages means now that economic opportunity in the United States is not what it once was. This article from the Wall Street Journal stresses how barely half of 30-year-olds earn more than their parents did at a similar age. Yet in 1970, 92% of American 30-year-olds earned more than their parents at the same age. In 2014, that number fell to just 51%.
You've been took. You've been hoodwinked.
Do children end up doing better than their parents? So on the horizontal line is the year in which a child is born. So the first year that we have there is 1940, and the last year is 1985. And then you follow them into adulthood, and I think he's following them to age 30 or something. I can't remember exactly. Somebody born in 1940, 90% of those children ended up doing better than their parents in terms of earnings, their household earnings, okay? That stayed high for a while, but then it started falling and fell, so that somebody born in 1985 is currently earning only 50% of those children are actually doing better than their parents if you look at earnings and adjust for inflation.
Today, a new study grabbed our attention. The middle class is no longer the majority in America. In 1971, 61% were considered middle class. Now that's down to 50%. Anthony Mason tells us why.
Meredith Riley, a 37-year-old social worker in New Jersey, used to think of herself as middle class.
It was the good life. It really was. It was wonderful. And now, if I don't go to work, I don't get paid.
Her county job, which paid about $50,000 a year, was eliminated in the recession. A single mother of two, Riley now works 3 part-time jobs and makes less money.
I think the toughest part is not preparing a future for my children that my parents prepared for me.
Barely half of adults are now middle-income earners, defined as a household making between $42,000 and $126,000 annually. The percentage has been falling steadily since 1971. Richard Fry, who co-authored a new Pew Research study, says that as the middle class has hollowed out, the upper income bracket's grown from 14% to 21% of Americans. That upper class now takes home nearly half of all annual income in the U.S., 49%, up from 29% in 1970.
The first part of this video has shown that politicians such as Barack Obama and Bernie Sanders and news outlets such as CNN and the Wall Street Journal all have a common theme, that wages are stagnant or too low in this country, creating a lack of economic opportunity, which means the average American teenager today may not have nearly the economic opportunity that my parents had when they graduated high school in the early 1960s. The information alone contained in the first part of this video, that wages have been stagnant for over 40 years, is troubling and disturbing enough. But the next set of information the video is going to present to you makes the problem seem much, much, much more unfair.
Bamboozled, led astray.
This is the table made from the data set from the Bureau of Labor Statistics about weekly wages and benefits per worker as they change over time. In the table we showed you earlier, made mention weekly wages and benefits were $782 per worker per week in 1972, and they fell and rose slightly again, and now they're $681 per worker per week for wages and benefits by 2010. The data set from earlier in the video is incomplete. The Bureau of Labor Statistic data goes back even further, and I'll show you the rest of the table as I scroll upward. Here is what was missing previously from the table I shared earlier in the video. Weekly wages and benefits in 1950 were $440 per week, or $11 an hour, $22,000 per year. That's what the average worker experienced in 1950. Just 6 years later, weekly wages and benefits had risen by roughly $100 per week, and had risen by almost $5,000 per year per worker. Just 9 years later, workers saw an increase of wage and benefits to $733 per week, which is $18 an hour. So wages for the average worker jumped up by $7 an hour, or roughly $15,000 per year in just 15 years. By 1972, they had reached their peak at $782 per week. How is it we've gone from an economy that could create basically a doubling of workers' wages, not quite doubling, but near doubling of workers' wages from 1950 to 1972. And now we have an economy where the expectation is not that workers' wages will rise, but that they'll go down, and that should be considered normal. This graph shows how the country had almost a doubling of workers' wages and benefits from 1950 to 1972. It was a very simple idea that the expectation once was in the country, as workers got more productive, as they got more machinery in the factories and new technology and better management techniques, as workers got more productive here, the orange line, their real wages grew along with their productivity growth, which is the red line. Basing wage growth on productivity growth was a very simple idea, and it allowed the United States to double basically the workers' standard of living from 1950 to 1972. This is a simple idea our country has forgotten. We forgot it starting about 1973, and since then we have not practiced what we once did. Wages here have been flat in red. From 1947 to 1973, wages grew with productivity increases. The next series of videos show how productivity can rise with workers getting new machinery and how wages can rise without causing inflation.
Meet Joe, the king of the workers of the world.
Hi, folks.
Joe's the king because he can buy more with his wages than any other worker on the globe. Now, what makes it possible for Joe to earn such a good living? He's no smarter than workers in other countries.
Are you kidding?
He's no stronger than workers in other lands. Just because Joe's an American doesn't mean...
Yeah? Well, being an American is the best thing on the... Oh! My back!
Sure, being an American is great, but how could you be superior to any foreigner when you or your folks might be any one of a dozen different races or religions? So, if you're no Superman, it must be the American way of doing things that makes you the luckiest guy in the world.
I don't think I'm so lucky.
You don't? Well, let me show you.
Who's the character?
That's your grandfather, Joe.
Oh.
He had to work 69 hours a week to earn a living because he had only inexpensive hand tools and his own strength to help him make things. Your grandfather was a powerful man, yet his strength equaled only 1/10 of a horsepower. You have hundreds of horsepower in this costly giant of a machine to multiply your strength and efficiency 1,000 times. This makes it possible for you to earn more than any worker in history. And still have leisure time each day to enjoy life.
So I'm lucky. But what about the rich guy who does nothing while I do the work?
True, there are rich people who contribute nothing. And there are poor people who contribute the same. But most of the invested capital that buys the tools you use comes from your fellow Americans. 40 million of us have money in the banks. 70 million of us own insurance policies. Over 15 million of us invest savings in corporation stocks and bonds, which help to finance industry. Each year, the people of America invest billions of dollars to create new plants and equipment. This invested capital buys the tools which make a man's labor worth more because he produces more.
This table has the Bureau of Labor Statistics data in it here in the left columns, and to that I've added the average price of a new car adjusted for inflation in 2010 dollars. And you'll notice in 1950 a new car cost $1,500 and $10 on average. Adjusted for inflation, that was $14,000 in 2010 dollars. So in 1950 it took a worker 1,280 hours of work at the average wage to afford to buy a new car. By 1956, the same worker had to work only 1,098 hours. Almost 200 hours fewer of work to buy a new car. Why? Because cars cost roughly the same in 1956 as they did in 1950, but wages had risen. The similar effect continues through 1965. 1965, it only takes 958 hours to buy a new car. By 1972, it was only 927 hours to buy a new car. That's 300 hours fewer hours of work to buy a new car. That's roughly 8 weeks of work, 2 months of work fewer to buy a new car. You'll notice that trend reverses by 1980. The number of hours needed to be put in by the average worker to buy a car was almost as high as it was back in 1950. And by 1989 and 1996, the hours of work needed to buy a car was more than 1950.
Wages and prices often play leapfrog. One jumps up, then the other, which means a steady rise in our cost of living. The Dilly Doll Factory is a happy shop. But Joe, our doll painter friend, seems to be a little down in the mouth, which even shows in his work. Joe is pretty discouraged because the high cost of living makes it harder and harder to make ends meet.
Hiya, Joe, old boy.
Hello.
Better look in that envelope.
Wow, a raise! And just in time to buy the kid a birthday present. What'll I get? Let's see. A dress? Bicycle? Roller skates? Shoes? A book? A doll? A doll! What's the price, miss? I work in a factory that makes this doll. $2 is too much.
I'm very sorry, sir, but your company charged us more for this shipment, so we had to raise our selling price.
We got a wage increase, all right, but it couldn't raise the price that much. It just takes a little wood, rubber, paint, cloth, and a phony wig to make that doll. There's only about 10 cents worth of materials in the whole thing. You pirates, crooks, bandits, you robbers!
You're right about the cost of raw materials in that doll, about 10 cents worth. Raw materials in practically everything we buy are worth little until labor transforms them into finished products. For example, how much do you think the raw materials cost in that car?
Oh, about $300.
You've got a surprise coming. It takes 4.5 tons of coal, 2 3/4 tons of iron ore, 50 pounds of cotton, 14 pounds of cured and finished wool, aluminum, zinc, lead, copper, and countless other raw materials to make an automobile. Without the addition of labor costs, these things are worth about $22. The raw materials require the accumulated labor of thousands of people in countless crafts. In the $1,500 automobile, direct and indirect labor costs add up to approximately $1,200, or over 80% of the selling price. That's before taxes. And what happens to the other 20%, or $300? Raw material cost, $22. Profit to producers of raw materials and allied industries, $89. Profit to part manufacturers, $47. Profit to local dealer, $77. Profit to car manufacturer, $65. Now, when you add $400 for taxes, The cost is $1,900 to the buyer. Like the dolls you make, an automobile has a low raw material cost and a high labor cost, and that goes for practically everything we buy. Generally speaking, a wage raise means a corresponding rise in prices, unless productivity is increased proportionately.
What do you want, a guy with 4 arms? 4 arms? Say, I got a sensational idea.
To expand productivity, labor and management must work together to develop new ideas and techniques. To expand productivity, capital must finance the creation of more efficient tools and plants. The production of more and better goods at lower costs means that when you get a wage raise, it's a real raise.
A raise? A raise? I want to buy a doll. How much?
Now you've got a real wage raise, because you can buy more with what you earn. With increased productivity, wages can keep ahead of prices.
The video showed the intuition behind the graph on the screen here, that if workers get increases in productivity because of new machinery, equipment, or training, and their productivity goes up in orange, wages can rise along with those productivity gains in red, and the effect is the worker's better off, and the higher pay will not cause higher prices. There will be no inflation. In fact, in the video, Joe had a rising standard of living because his pay went up. Meanwhile, the price he had to pay in the store for the dolls produced by his company went down. This was the very simple idea the country practiced for the period of time from 1947 to 1973, and how workers' wages nearly doubled during a 25 to 30-year time span.
Here's an incredible fact, that if the typical American family still retained the same share of income that they did in 1970, they'd earn like $45,000 more a year. Imagine what our economy would be like if that were the case.
So if from 1973 until present, workers have not been receiving their productivity gains in the form of higher wages, the question becomes, where did this extra money go? Workers are producing more, yet their wages have been flat. Well, the short answer is the rich got the money. Corporate profits have doubled since 1980, and on average, workers' wages have been stagnant, and the incomes of the top 1% have skyrocketed. How much money is missing from the average worker's yearly wage? Well, earnings per household, if they had kept pace with productivity growth, would be roughly $40,000 more than they are today. That's the $40,000 that Nick Hanauer mentioned in the previous video clip, that households would not have $52,000 of average household earnings. They'd have closer to $90,000. Imagine how different your world would be if the average household had $40,000 more per year. And the upper middle class households had $60,000 or $70,000 more per year. And the lower middle class households had $20,000 more per year. That would be a significant change in the American standard of living.
You've been had.
Here's an incredible fact, that if the typical American family still retained the same share of income that they did in 1970, they'd earn like $45,000 more a year. Imagine what our economy would be like if that were the case.
So the video and the examples previously clearly show how you can have what's called a rising standard of living. From 1950 to 1972, workers' pay kept increasing. Why? Because they had productivity increases at their jobs. They had better equipment, more tools, more advanced training, and as those enhanced manufacturing techniques went into place, workers made more output per hour. Meanwhile, while their wages were rising from $11 an hour to $20 an hour, the price of the things they were making when they sold in stores stayed roughly the same. And so workers went from having to work 1,280 hours to buy a new car in 1950. By 1972, they only had to work 927 hours to buy a new car. And this is what's called a rising standard of living.
The constant investment of our savings through good times and bad has enabled our competitive business system to continue to increase the production of more and better goods to meet the demands of our rising population for a better standard of living. For example, it was only a little more than half a century ago that the average worker had only inefficient tools to help him turn out a product. Low production meant low wages. In 1900, many men had to work 10 hours a day, 6 days a week, to earn enough money to provide their families with the bare essentials. Hand labor was the rule in the home as well as the factory. In many families, the youngsters had to work to add their earnings to the family budget and forego the opportunity to get an education. And with most families in those days, the standard of living left much to be desired. A half-century later, we had invested enough in our business system to provide the average worker with efficient and expensive buildings and machinery to enable him to produce enough in a 40-hour week to earn twice as much as the 1900 worker earned in a 60-hour week. This shorter work week gives us all more leisure time to enjoy a standard of living beyond the wildest dreams of anyone who lived a half-century ago. The more we earn, the more our families have to spend for the things they need and want. Young people today have leisure time for fun and enjoy educational opportunities denied their fathers and grandfathers.